Warner Brothers' cinematic take on the DC universe is a solid counterpoint to Marvel Studios' fare, where films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are uniformly polished in a similar type of quippy action comedy vibe that is often indiscernible to one another, as well as taking place in the same well-laid-out continuity. DC films are more fluid. Whether we are discussing David Sandberg's Shazam, Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman, or James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, all the modern DC films, whether in the continuity of the DCEU or not, work as consistent standalone films that aren't necessarily tied to the same rigid continuity. They feel like tonally distinct creative visions that are more concerned with telling a cohesive story rather than trying to set up the next big crossover event, though that did occur egregiously that one fucking time. Overall, though, DC films are movies first and foremostly. Hell, even the films and shows in the DCEU with overlapping characters like Harley Quinn and Birds of Prey and the Suicide Squad, the good one, feel more fleshed out as narratively contained experiences in contrast to a competition that can blur together at times, which is refreshing, mostly due to how awesome films like Aquaman, Birds of Prey, and the Suicide Squad feel like completely unique superhero stories compared to a lot of the stuff that Marvel churns out. Though for posterity's sake, let me state for the record that I overall do like Marvel, believe it has a place in modern cinema, and am encouraged that some of their more recent stuff is branching out creatively, even if those projects don't always fully commit to that said creativity. But even with that caveat, DC films overall often have more stable identities as creative visions, and while some DC films aren't executed very well, i.e. Joker, Wonder Woman 1984, or any of the Zack Snyder outings, these films were at least bad in ways that were interesting. They had a creative vision, a failed creative vision, but a creative vision nonetheless. And that's key because whether we are discussing the great, the good, or the Ghostbusters 2 of superhero cinema, DC films are stylistically distinct from one another. They work as their own stories. This is true for The Batman as well. Directed by Matt Reeves of Cloverfield and War of the Planet of the Apes fame, The Batman is a dark, gritty, and adult take on everyone's favorite brooding caped crusader. Fitting in with modern DC films as being a distinct artistic piece, the movie is heavy on somber tones and gothic storytelling that really makes it one of a kind. Hell, even compared to Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, a series that really grounded the Batman franchise in a more realistic lens, The Batman is notably macabre, and as a result, the movie fits in with Warner Brothers' other DC offerings in that it feels like a distinctive creative effort and vision. After all, The Batman is a near 3-hour detective noir film as much as it is a superhero actioner, which is a very new and inspired take for both a superhero film and a live-action Batman adaptation in today's market, where so many superhero stories can feel the same in terms of their structure and tone. The Batman, like other DC movies, is its own thing. It is also really damn good. The movie works as a murder mystery, it has a thematically cohesive story about legacy, Robert Pattinson's performance as the title character is haunting, villains like the Riddler, Catwoman, Penguin, and Carmine Falcone are effectively placed in the narrative and don't overcrowd the film, the action feels real and grounded, and the movie instills a gothic and angsty feel, which I appreciated as someone who is moody and listens to a lot of good nu metal, because unlike conscientious corporate CEOs, good nu metal does actually exist in reality. You know it's true, praise be to Korn for getting that long overdue critical re-evaluation. The Batman's positive qualities start with its story. The plot follows Batman, whose alter ego is the billionaire Bruce Wayne, who, for the last 2 years, has been fighting the criminal element in the fictional Gotham City, a metropolis that is heavy in all sorts of anarchy. The crux for Batman's war on crime is due to the fact that he was orphaned after his parents were murdered outside a movie theater, probably after seeing Deuce Bigelow. But Batman's escapades eventually run into a newer and more dangerous element. See, a serial killer dubbed the Riddler is murdering and plotting to murder a string of high-profile Gotham City power players and actively leaves riddles and clues behind that Batman must solve in order to learn the Riddler's motives. And from there, Batman and his ally in Jeffrey Wright's Detective Gordon try to read between the lines of the Riddler's clues so that they can potentially get ahead of the Riddler and bring him to justice. The story is pretty awesome, mostly because this incarnation of Batman is among the most interesting to date. Where past Batman portrayals got stuck in portraying the Bruce Wayne playboy billionaire angle, the Batman thoroughly commits to being a story about Bruce Wayne's trauma and the fact that he deals with it incredibly poorly. In fact, Batman is often very self-centered at times. His motivations for being the Batman are less about fighting fighting crime for the benefit of others, but more due to being a way to cope with his trauma, grief, and other problems, which the film portrays in a negative light. After all, he only goes through the motions of being Bruce Wayne and does fuck all to use his financial avenues to actually combat citywide corruption and the corrosive social elements that make crime so appealing, and possibly a necessity. Also, he can dress up as a bat and punch criminals who have the same likelihood to beat him in a fistfight as Michael fucking Cera. Batman mostly dons the cowl for his own benefit rather than to help others, and that's a really unexplored, fascinating, and good angle in both the superhero space and even Batman films. After all, past Batman films describe the Batman aspect of Bruce's personage as being the character's true identity, but this is honestly the first time around that I actually believed it. In past films, Bruce, while very much a workaholic when it came to crime fighting, did have ties to Bruce Wayne. He actively tried to run Wayne Enterprises, he actively had romantic interest as Bruce Wayne, he had connections to the actual world outside of his Batcave, and all those high-end computers that can emulate all of the video games, even the ones Nintendo hasn't re-released for the 5th time on a new console for $60, those fucks. But in the Batman, Bruce Wayne has zero interest in running his business, improving upon his family legacy, or engaging with the actual world unless he absolutely has to. His whole identity is basically Batman. He lives and breathes his late nights in the Cape, serving knuckle sandwiches to criminals with nary a smile. He's obsessed. And that's an interesting narrative angle, because honestly, he basically dons the Batsuit as his own form of therapy rather than for altruistic reasons, which is a very new narrative wrinkle for a character that has existed since 1939. It is a fresh take. Furthermore, Bruce Wayne's obsession with being Batman and inability to function in normal settings makes for a great heroic arc. Throughout the film, Batman is confronted with some hard truths about himself, and that causes him to be introspective about his life. Does he really want his legacy as a vigilante to just be striking fear in Gotham's criminal element, or does he deep down aspire to be something greater, but is often unable or even unwilling to express that? It's a good conundrum that makes for some enticing cinema and ultimately ends on a narratively satisfying note. It's quite good. The Batman's nature as a noir murder mystery is pretty great as well, especially considering we as an audience already know who the Riddler is. See, most murder mysteries follow police officers or detectives who use evidence and clues to figure out who killed someone. See so many British and American television shows, except Sherlock. Don't see that, it's bad. But the Batman forges new ground by making a compelling story not about the identity of the killer, but more about his motives. In the film, we learned that the Riddler is trying to reveal a major city-wide conspiracy that exists, unlike QAnon. This conspiracy surrounds an undercover sting that led to a crime lord's arrest and featured a secret informant. And from there, the movie teases many questions that allow the audience to become invested in the film. What does this bust have to do with the Riddler's murders? Who is the informant? How are the Penguin and Catwoman caught up in this? And many other questions later on in the movie that are overall engrossing. But I won't reveal too much here because of spoilers. Just trust that the movie delivers a good mystery, and one that really heightens up the detective aspect of Batman's persona, which hadn't really been done as much in previous live-action Batman fare, and as a result, it does an awesome job and feels like its own film. The movie is also stacked with a great cast who play their parts to perfection. Robert Pattinson's downcast and haunted makeup look shows how far he has come since Twilight, though there are other movies that have already proved that. Paul Dano's The Riddler is notably creepy. Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman is simultaneously alluring and a compelling anti-hero in her own right. Jeffrey Wright's Detective Gordon is interesting because he's one of the only characters who sees Batman as an asset rather than just a freak to be feared. Andy Serkis's Alfred is a good supportive presence and one that Bruce Wayne desperately needs. John Don't Mess with the Jesus Tartaro's Carmine Falcone is cold and calculating, and Colin Farrell's Penguin makes for a very sleazy mobster, though I will say that I think they should have cast an actor that actually looks like the Penguin rather than having Farrell don some admittedly impressive makeup and prosthetics, but that's just me. But regardless of character, they are all very well played from top to bottom, add their own unique spin to the story, and don't overcrowd the narrative. All the characters and actors are really complementary to each other, which is impressive to note because in the past, there have been superhero films that feature way too many damn characters and villains and feel overcrowded, see Spider-Man 3, but the Batman pulls it off well here. It definitely feels like an ensemble piece. The Batman's gothic tone strikes a down-tuned chord as well. The dark lighting sets a dark mood, the horror movie elements where criminals fear that the Batman is lurking in every shadow and crevice is a nice touch. The action and most of the practical effects make the events of the movie feel immediate, real, real and lived in. The more grounded costumes overall work here. The Batmobile being a muscle car speaks to my lesbian identity. The use of Nirvana's Something in the Way was an inspired song choice that complemented the somber tone of the narrative, and the score by Michael Giacchino is fantastic, and the main theme sounds like a funeral procession, which I appreciate as someone who is gothic on the inside. See my obsession with Slipknot. It's all really good. With that said, the Batman has a few minor problems. Firstly, the script often tries to spell out the events of the movie even though it doesn't need to. Like, for example, Batman will solve one of the Riddler's riddles, and Detective Gordon will literally explain Batman's answer to another cop, which didn't need to happen. Like, hey movie, I was watching the movie too. Don't need to explain everything again. Just saying. And yeah, I get that it's a minor quibble, but the movie explaining what just happened does happen a few times, and enough to make me at least note it here. Another problem is the PG-13 rating, because honestly, it should have been made to be rated R, which admittedly is a point I'm about to probably get some flack for. While I get that some people online have criticized the movie for being dark and gritty and a Batman film that you can't take your child to, which is a valid critique, we are talking about fucking Batman after all. But this film, given the type of movie that it is, would have really benefited from an R rating. As a movie, the Batman is very dark, brutal, and often dirty, but honestly, it could have conveyed a darker and even filthier tone with more blood and more liberal uses of certain curse words that often comes with being rated R. It could have been even more true to its narrative and tonal aspirations. Also, I would have liked it because I'm a sick fuck and was disappointed with the lack of blood splatter. Because it is a problem, let the blood flow like the river Eisen, damn it. Still, these are minor issues, and the Batman is overall pretty great. It features some terrific performances, especially the lead. Its portrayal of a haunted and morally flawed Bruce Wayne is very interesting. The movie strikes an evocative gothic tone. The mystery elements are fantastic, and the movie ultimately has its own distinct identity in the superhero landscape. Even among Batman films, the Caped Crusader soars in the Batman. And with that, that was the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of the Batman. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month or more allows you to make review requests. The link to the Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.